Good afternoon, everyone. Karen was saying earlier that this being a Wednesday and coming off a long weekend, it feels a little weird, a little early in the week to be meeting with you all. But thank you, everyone, for participating today and throughout the process. Hard to believe this is our 10th meeting of the CowTac. So at our last meeting, our last few meetings, we've been revisiting a few topics related to Goal 10. Last week we talked, or the last meeting, excuse me, we talked about using recent development trends to inform future capacity. And we also talked a little bit about how we treat publicly owned lands and CC&Rs. Today is going to be actually the last time for a while that we talk about Goal 10. We will certainly revisit it later on once we have some draft rules to look at and review. But following today's meeting, we're going to be shifting our focus to Goal 14. But as for today, our first topic relates to buildable land inventories and constraints, looking at how we standardize assumptions and methodologies across cities. And our second topic is going to focus on potential safe harbors, looking specifically at partially vacant lands and also kind of the data available for doing the buildable lands assessments. So I want us to, for that topic, again, we want to be, for both topics, we want to be thinking about these issues within the context of guidance and rules and safe harbors. And I'm going to remind us again, because I think hopefully it was helpful last time, that our overall objectives for the work that we're doing is to provide greater clarity and certainty, to reduce analytical burden, and to minimize redundancy in this Goal 10 work. So before Karen gives us a little more in-depth introduction to each of those topics, Jenna is going to introduce the racial equity framework focus areas for today. And I think we can get the PowerPoint back up there. There we go. Go ahead, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So today's racial equity framework focus area is data equity and data justice. And we first introduced this focus area back in July at our 6th meeting together, where we talked about how cities might consider data equity and justice around housing trends and costs, choosing whether or not to show redevelopable areas in the BLI and mitigating displacement risk, and how to use data equitably to inform future investments and decision-making. So we're going to continue building off of this for today's discussion, and we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So since we'll be discussing potential safe harbors in the BLI today, the key questions for consideration under this focus area are: 1, how can safe harbors and/or guidance for buildable land inventories increase data equity and access for jurisdictions with fewer resources and less data availability? We've heard from you all in past meetings how data challenges can make it really difficult to accurately estimate land capacity, especially for smaller cities. So let's continue to discuss more how we can close that gap for today. And the second question for consideration is: how might safe harbors for partially vacant lands increase or decrease data equity? And some considerations are, if it's assumed that land of a particular value, such as high value land, will not redevelop, and that is then subtracted from the BLI, how might this put more pressure on other areas of the city, or even at the edge of a UGB, to absorb needed housing? And how can we make sure we're not reinforcing existing inequities? On the other hand, leaving in those areas that are unlikely to develop or redevelop can also lead to phantom capacity. And so what considerations should cities take into account when discounting or mapping certain land. And I hope to get further into these topics as we go deeper into the discussion today. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Jenna. And we'll go to Kaden to introduce our first BLI topic of the day.
Oops, here we go. Mute. There we are. I put a couple questions in the chat for you all. So this is something that has come up in past discussions. So remember in April, we talked about constraints. I think some of the questions that came up then were around, well, there are buildable land technically, and sometimes it's just impractical to assume development or capacity. And what does that look like when there's buildable land surrounded by constraints or otherwise slivers or island that get counted? So I thought we would share, let me see if I can pull this down and share a couple examples. I'm gonna have you all on my desktop for a little while. Looks like this is running slow. All right, here you go. So this one will look familiar. And now my computer decides to slow down. I see it spinning. Bear with this for a second. It'll come no time at all. All right, that didn't work. We're going to move this way. Hopefully this will let me zoom in. No, that's not gonna work. So this is the city of Roseburg. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit here just to illustrate. There's a donut of land that is not annexed into the city. So we've got this little donut, and that's not rare. But the complexity, I think, that we're showing here around buildable land is the constrained areas. I'm assuming there's slopes, landslide hazards. I'm actually not exactly sure what constraints are shown here in orange. And then you'll see slivers or islands of this white area that's buildable. And how do we account for these types of parcels within an inventory? I think we have one other example we can show here. I'm not sure why Teams is just being, Teams gets to be Teams sometimes. Here we go. And again, up here in this corner, Derek, if you're with us today, you'll recognize all of these lands in your inventory. And so as we look at where the constrained areas are, and then maybe a little island of buildable area, this one is, you can see little slivers along the river. So you can see there's probably some floodplain, some slopes, additional constraints, and then you'll see little pockets where it's shown as unconstrained. And what acreage that makes up, how feasible these islands and these slivers are. I think there was a desire for the group to at least discuss the idea of what does that look like in an inventory? What could that look like in an inventory if we're assessing real capacity for housing? And what does that look like in terms of paper capacity and phantom capacity versus feasibility, practical and ability to develop? So I wanted to open that up to the floor. And then in the chat, we have some questions for you around how do we standardize these assumptions? What are cities doing at the local level? Is there a framework that we could provide that gives you just enough flexibility to really take in the local context, but gives us an accurate and fair just depiction or illustration of what you have as far as residential capacity on your buildable land. So folks in the room, let's see what I don't know who we've got in the room.
Beth's gonna kick us off here.
Yeah, got some comments. All right.
May I share my screen for just one moment to show you the inverse of what you were just showing? If that's okay. So here is Roseburg, and this is the land that's buildable amongst all of those constraints. So Karn was, talking about this area here, which is not annexed to the city, but you've got this little tiny strip of land here, or these things that look kind of, I don't know, they always look to me like fjords. And what do you do with them? How do you reasonably get development in an area like this? We see this really commonly among cities where you have these little tiny, essentially stranded pieces of land. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Beth. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just preface this by saying all the numbers that I'm going to throw in here are entirely hypothetical, just for examples, but maybe some kind of consideration about, whether or not it's been included in a BLI before, if there's any, existing plans to develop there. If it has been in the BLI for a certain number of years, let's say it's been 20 years since it was included into the UGB, and it was considered BLI, but it's never developed. Maybe that's a point where you start to exclude it. So I don't know if there's like a time frame sort of aspect to this. But
Thanks. Kasara.
Yeah, I think timing is important. Another consideration is, even if you have what's considered a buildable area that's maybe surrounded by steep slopes or Goal 5 resources, I'm thinking from the utility perspective, it's going to be a challenging process even to get, a sewer line or something through that area to serve it. So just another consideration, and maybe, leaning toward perhaps not designating them as buildable.
Thank you. Damien?
Thanks. Pardon me for just a second. So I had a couple thoughts that might be appropriate for a safe harbor here, if that's part of our conversation here. I think in terms of looking at some of these areas that are islands, I can think of examples of cities where they have a definition of what is like a minimum lot size or buildable area for property in order to be developed. And so maybe looking at that as part of a safe harbor to say, if you're looking at these areas, look at how much land is actually part of your buildable area, meaning it could meet setbacks, have access to a street, utilities, and then, combined with that, provide some kind of safe harbor on development assumptions. So after the BLI is done, looking down at the capacity of that property to say, that's probably not going to get its, maybe not even a minimum density requirement, but, if there's, say, room for a house, say, count that, but that might be about it. So you may be treating something that doesn't have as much buildable capacity as, say, there's a lot across the street that has no constraints, but may have some. Realistically, not phantom, but, something that could be incorporated in the housing capacity.
So kind of discounting its capacity, maybe rather than kind of removing it completely.
And that might be a good option, and it may not be the best option for all the land that's constrained.
So Steve, I think I'm going to make this really messy, and I'm just going to put it all on the table here because we don't need to come up with agreement or consensus today, but I just want to put it all on the table. So a couple of things that I didn't mention that I want to go back to, the Newport example versus the Roseburg example. In Roseburg, they're going to pursue a UGB land swap for a lot of that area. So I showed you the very constrained area with little pockets and slivers. They're like, we don't even know why this is in our UGB. They're actively in a program, a work program to swap, not all of it, but a lot of what I showed you out. Newport has also been considering UGB land swap. I'm not sure that it was that area that I showed you. Sorry, Derek, I'm not up to date on your city programs today. So that begs the question, what we've been talking about as a TAC or as a committee, and certainly what we've been talking about as staff here in the department, is maybe there's land within UGBs that were added at time of acknowledgement. 40 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't know, and it shouldn't be there. There's one way to address that. And I don't know that we need that in rule per se, but we need to talk about it as a group here. There's one way of addressing that. And then we as a group, starting in October, really get to look at urbanization rules in Goal 14 and Division 24, and really thinking about the selection criteria when land is brought in. What has been the practice of the department? What is being implemented by practitioners at the local level, and how should that happen? So we don't end up with land in our UGB that we ultimately 20 years want to swap out and say it should have never gotten there. So we get to think about that October and into next year. But for now, if cities have this land and it's very constrained, and I'm not going to repeat everything that Cassara and everybody else said, is the only course of action for a local government to swap it out? Is there a possibility for removing some of this from an inventory? And do we need guardrails around that? Brock brought up some examples of maybe you could remove it from the inventory if it meets these thresholds. Or I think, you know, Heather, I remember you sharing with us in April in Eugene, there was a discount factor, anything over 900 feet elevation or something. I can't remember. There was slopes and elevation involved, and Eugene discounted and said, we consider one house per lot. And I think I heard Damien, you say that today. So here we have a bunch of options on the table. And it's like putting a kid in front of a candy store. Like, I don't know which candy I want. They all sound great to me. So we really need to think through that, because as we talk about that today, staff will go back and write some draft rules saying, here's what we heard from the TAC, here's what we see as implementable feasible from a state perspective. Each of us will bring our local government experience into this, but the more information we get from you all, so that when you see those draft rules, you're like, ah, I see where staff went. They took our discussion and they took our feedback, and here's the draft rules that now we need to help them revise. So I see hands up. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Karen, you know, of the three options you gave there, obviously the Roseburg option, the land exchange option, is a lot more feasible when your islands are close to the edge of your UGB, but what happens when they're more centrally located?
Steve, that was in my notes, so I appreciate, because I'm totally off script today.
No, you got it. Let's keep rolling with it. Go ahead, Brock.
Would it be possible to have like a handful of different sort of methodologies for this, and let local governments kind of choose which, you know, one of these three kind of fits best with their area? Because like I imagine, like for Bend, it's going to be very different than it is for a coastal community, particularly with the new NFIP regulations that are, you know, being developed right now, which is going to look entirely different from, you know, Roseburg or let's say somewhere in Hardy County. But just kind of having like a, you know, pick this or this based on like what your real development barriers are, whether that's slopes or floodways or anything like that. And just kind of come up with like a choose your path option.
Kind of different thresholds for using a different methodology. And I saw Beth nodding her head when you started talking, Brock. Heather, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that our 1 unit per lot over 900 is because we have a policy in a neighborhood plan. So you can get more than that, I think, if you go through a planned unit development, but you're kind of allowed outright to have 1 unit per lot. But that said, could that be a safe harbor that kind of discounts the density that would otherwise be assumed on a buildable area that is maybe meets the minimum lot size, like Damien was saying, but is surrounded by constraints? I could see that. And if it doesn't have services, it's probably super unlikely to get served because the cost doesn't pencil out to do that. So I really like the idea of some sort of discount. And I'm checking with someone else on our team to see what we did in our urban reserves process. I know that's different because it's not inside the UGB, but I'll chime back in once I have that information.
Thank you, Heather. Let's go to Corey and then we'll go back to Damien. No problem.
Sorry, thank you. And apologies for being late. I just had a couple comments, and so if you covered this at the top of the call, my apologies. But just kind of this current thread, I tended to agree. I had a question that came up with Brock's comment. And just curious, Karen, if you feel like there is the need to narrow, right? So that we've got all these options, all these ideas on the table, right? Every city is different, right? Are you like, where's staff's head in terms of thinking about being inclusive of like a lot of different options, or really trying to be more narrow here?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we ultimately, it is the commission, LCDC, Land Conservation Development Commission, that will adopt these rules. They will not be adopting these rules until December of 2025. So if I had to say what is most helpful and useful right now is to be really open-minded, inclusive of all ideas, because staff can spend legislative session next year while you all and us are very busy with the legislative session. We can start investigating all the different paths and saying, here's the pitfalls, here's the trade-offs. But if we can talk about those trade-offs as much as possible today, so here's my concerns with this path. Here's what we lose when we do it this way. Here's the flexibility we gain, and here's the accountability we lose. Then that all goes into our deliberation, and it's a good way to guide us. You know, there are 3 different options on the table. 2 of them are strong. I can see a hybrid between 1 and 3 and what that looks like, because then we get to spend January through March researching. And when we come back together, we hope to have some draft rules for y'all to look at around May or June. But we will also, all of us collectively will be together really deep in the Goal 14 Division 24-21 at that time too. So if that helps.
That does, thank you. And then I had another question that just had to do with sort of the safe harbors in general. And so I appreciated recirculating that memo back from our conversations in May. I thought it was really helpful to revisit that. But we have existing safe harbors. And so I was curious, you know, are we thinking that like those ones that we do have are going to stay on the books and they've worked well, and we're going to be adding to that? Or are there going to be scenarios where we say, hey, these pieces, right, like haven't worked all that well. We're going to be augmenting them. We're going to be supplanting them with things that we come up with in this group. And just curious, again, sort of like the take there on what that might look like.
Yeah, Corey, I almost don't want to answer your question, except I'm so opinionated, I have an opinion. So I'll give you the staff, you know, the got an opinion perspective on it, but I really want to take your question and pose that to the group. Because here's what I'm hearing here's what we've been hearing from the group. When we talked about this in April, when you guys shared your feedback on the Miro board, is there are around partially vacant lands, it makes sense, and I think it's working well, a safe harbor for smaller cities under 25,000. I think what we've heard from larger cities, Bend, Eugene, is there's a lot of manual work. I think we had Medford come visit us because they don't have a safe harbor. And I can't expect a Medford to invest in the same way Eugene has. I mean, props to y'all, what you're doing. You didn't even see this rulemaking coming when you were, but how does rulemaking facilitate that for mid-sized jurisdictions?
Right. And I think it's just saying, and it is a question for this group, for those smaller jurisdictions under 25K, right? Like, have those safe harbors proved helpful? And if this is ground that we've already covered, forgive me again, but I think it's just as we look to model future new additional safe harbors, right? I think it's really helpful to get ground and understand like what has worked well, right, and what hasn't. And so I think there's been some explicit discussions about that like over time, but I think it's just one that we want to kind of continue to look to, right? Of sort of like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. For some of these, they've been clear enough or they've been sufficient, right? So I think I just had that comment to share with the group. And then I think related to this discussion, I think some of the ideas put in around sort of discounting the capacity make a lot of sense. And I think that there's been some other interesting kind of comments, but I think that that one, you know, rather than a full removal in some cases, would make sense. So just wanted to share that, and thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I had a number of thoughts that aren't terribly specific, but hopefully it might help inform the discussion and future work. I think as we look at this topic of constraints, being able to consider either as a safe harbor or as a maybe like a safe harbor, you know, looking at the proportion of a lot that's actually constrained and its location. You know, if we're dealing with something where the north half of the lot is constrained, but the south half has still got some buildable area, that's something that we could consider as part of a BLI. And then as we look at this topic of like safe harbors and trying to estimate building capacity, having a frame to look at these rules and so that a local government knows when they're done. Like if you do these steps, this is your BLI. It may not be without legal risk, but at least, you know, a reasonable person might also look at the same data and go, oh, okay, we get it. You're done. Yep, you've estimated capacity. So thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Beth, go ahead.
So I'm going to attempt to partially answer the question that was asked about whether the safe harbors are working. I would say they've been helpful to the smaller cities I've worked with, but they're also not sufficient. In other words, it at least answers the question Damien just posed. Are you good enough? So if you're using the existing safe harbor to identify partially vacant lands, then you know that you don't have to identify smaller partially vacant lands than the safe harbor requires, but you're still left with the islands that are hard to develop, issues with partially vacant land on slopes, where you know you can get less density on slopes just because of like the geometry of a slope, but you don't have a great clear way to make some assumption about the capacity on that slope. So I personally hope that that safe harbor doesn't go away for small cities, and that there's additional options for small and larger cities.
Thanks, Beth. Heather.
So sadly, we did look at urban reserves at if there was anything we felt like we could do as far as land, considering the capacity of land that was an island, the scenario we're talking about that's surrounded by constraints, either discounting the capacity or not bringing it into the urban reserve area. And the state of those islands were such that we did count capacity and we did include some in our urban reserves areas. So that wasn't a good example, but it got me thinking a little bit about, again, about the safe harbor and wondering if one safe harbor might be kind of a combination of things. So again, if it's an island that's surrounded by constraints, however you've just, you know, whatever they are in your different buildable lands inventories, is not already served or planned to be served. I would say not already served. And that instead of thinking about the minimum lot size, what if it was more like really it has to be big enough for development to happen, to warrant happening on the site because it's surrounded by constraints. And again, some of those maybe wouldn't happen, but it would be a way to kind of say, okay, some of these islands might actually develop and some of them won't. So if we apply this generalized, it's not served, it's surrounded by constraints, and I'm just going to throw this out as an example, and it's big enough for whatever the minimum number of lots are needed for a subdivision or something like that. That though, you know, there's something to play with there, like what your threshold, if it if it doesn't meet all of those things or it's smaller than that, then you can not count capacity on it. So just a thought.
Thanks, Heather. That's really helpful. That's, I think, where we were hoping we kind of lead this conversation. Are there any reactions to what Heather proposed or other kind of, we've gotten a few specific ideas. Derek?
Yeah, I generally agree with the others on this. Some sort of ratio-based approach with buildable versus constrained. I think there's room to kind of work on that. I also want to keep in mind the maps that we showed earlier. You know, our slope constraints that we chose to go were, you know, you're talking about 40% or more in terms of your slopes, whereas I think Roseburg took the typical 25%. So not everybody is approaching this from the same perspective. So all constraints aren't equal. I would say that from a smaller jurisdiction, we know that a substantial amount of the acreage that we have that's theoretically buildable is not. You know, so one of the issues, and I look forward to the further discussion on this, has to do with how long land has been inside the urban growth boundary. We have quite a bit that's been in since original acknowledgement, and it's not developing, and it's not developing for a number of the reasons we've been talking about, you know, severe constraints, so on and so forth. And so some flexibility to move those out of the UGB without having to go through land swaps and extensive processes, that would be very helpful.
Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I wanted to react to the last two comments because there are things that we can consider around what is in rule. To Corey's point, we have things in rule. How well have they been working? Beth, you illustrated quite a bit, some benefits, limitations to that. We have some safe harbors. Are we adding new safe harbors? Are we revising any of the safe harbors we have? At this point, I'm going to naively put myself out there and say, I think we're adding, if anything. And then the need for flexibility. So a safe harbor is an optional opt-in to reduce some legal liability. Rules create a little bit more clarity. It's not an opt-in, you follow the rule as is. And then there's guidance. So, you know, the department has not updated their guidance document for planning for housing in quite some time. Are there things that we could put in guidance, which means we cannot require you cities to do it, but if it's in guidance, it becomes commonly practiced, is kind of what's happened, except a lot of our guidance got outdated and hasn't kept up with statutory changes. But if we could think about what are the trade-offs of having certain guidelines in rule or certain requirements in rule. What does it do to have a safe harbor? And what are some of the unintended consequences of that? And then where are the benefits of, you know, that would be better suited for guidance. And we understand that guidance does not come with accountability. So if you choose to follow the guidance, DLCD cannot regulate in any way your choice to deviate from the guidance. But it gives you some clarity, gives you some direction, and it provides a lot of flexibility that you know, to Derek's point, that there's a safe harbor for slopes over 25%, but their local context is very different. We can see development up to, and they're not alone in that. They're not the only jurisdiction. So they've chosen not to use that safe harbor, but they have security and past development trends, and they know that they can write findings to how they do their land inventory. So that was my reaction. So Corey, how are staff thinking about this? We literally are thinking about what is better suited and provide the local flexibility of guidance. Where do we need to provide greater legal certainty? And then where can we, as a department, uphold accountability? I think that's the mind frame that we're coming at it with.
So maybe other thoughts. Oh, yeah, just 1 second, Brock. Yeah, looking for other thoughts on, you know, what has been proposed, if there's preferences, as to kind of what some of those thresholds might be. Several people have thrown different ones out in terms of the time, how long it's been in the inventory, whether it can be serviced, the nature of the constraints, the potential yield of the land, or concerns about any particular approach, something that you wouldn't want to see used as a safe harbor or in guidance or rule. Brock.
There may or may not be a good way to do this, but kind of thinking about how we're building the NAPTAC and HOTAC rules, if we had some kind of like objective threshold, essentially, right? Like if you're, not meeting your housing production target by this much, right, then you get sent into an acceleration program. If you have a BLI and, it's not keeping pace with your growth, or like the accuracy of it doesn't meet a certain threshold, then maybe you have to come back in, not like the acceleration program that's currently drafted, but something like that, where it's like, okay, you hit this mark, right? You called all these developed and they're not going to, apparently. And then now maybe, okay, now it's time that you got to come in and we got to work through this and come to an agreement about how we're going to adjust your BLI going forward.
So thoughts around that, because that's interesting for cities above 10,000. If you're doing a housing capacity analysis every 8 years outside the metro region, and you've got land that doesn't develop, are there thresholds of it's severely constrained, it's small in acreage, it's, what's small in acreage, what's tiny in acreage, what is severely constrained, it's surrounded, it's got a lot of complexities. I am reluctant. Okay, Beth, I'm going to out us. Beth and I have been having a private chat. I'm reluctant about serviceability and cost. But let's just say, because others have thrown it out too, it's not serviceable. It's too costly to service. Corey, you asked how staff are feeling about that. That one's a little bit more, that one's tough for the department. If it's showing up in your BLI in 1 8-year cycle, in 2 8-year cycle, and at what point, like, it's not buildable. It's like we can't find a planning horizon. It's not our 20-year, it's not our 50-year reserve. So that's, I don't know. I'm throwing a lot of questions at you all, just because this is what we're grappling with. Steve, I'll turn back over.
Yeah, Beth, why don't you go ahead and then we'll go to Alyssa.
I'll try to keep this short. In response to what Brock was just saying, what it made me think of is almost every city I've worked with has land that certainly hasn't developed over a 20-year period. And our system requires you to assume that all of your land will develop over a 20-year period. The only city that I've ever worked with that came close to having zero land in their buildable inventory was King City, which is a little tiny city right next to Tigard, where they had 3 acres of buildable land. All the other cities have a fair bit of buildable land that just hasn't developed or hasn't yet. And sometimes that's okay. When you look at a place like Redmond, they have a fair bit of land that they've got in essentially an urban holding zone that as they get, services out to it and that kind of thing, it's developing. And that seems like a good choice by decision. In other words, that doesn't seem like bad policy there. Then you look at a place like Madras during the 2008 to 2018 period, their land was essentially frozen. They just weren't getting hardly any development at all. And it turns out when we started asking stakeholders why, it was about some of their infrastructure policies. In other words, too expensive to develop, some other reasons that when the city, did what was the equivalent of an HPS, it wasn't an HPS, but the kind of equivalent of it, they unfroze their market and they got more. And so, Brock, I can certainly see your point in some of that. And in other cases, the way our system's designed, you're always going to have land that's not going to develop.
Yeah,
not showing the good
absolutely.
and bad
I
of
didn't mean to imply that it needed to be 100% used by the end of the planning cycle, right?
that. Yeah, it shouldn't be.
I think
Yeah.
if we're looking at like a 20-year planning cycle, it's more reasonable to say, okay, if it's been there for 20 years, then maybe it's time to start discounting that, but
But
not.
what about when you have it like in the middle of your city? It's, and oftentimes it's kind of, chunks, big chunks sometimes in the middle of your city held by somebody who just doesn't want to develop it.
Yeah, and I think context nuance is definitely going to be important there. 100% agree with that. Yeah.
Thanks both. Alyssa?
Well, I think you've all laid out very well what the constraints are. And when we get to the question that Karin keeps posing, which is how do we know whether and how it's ever going to be buildable? To me, there's like this cost, time, complexity threshold that you kind of have to look at. And for me, the way to look at it is like, what's the solution that would make this land buildable? And so in the cost, time, complexity threshold, is it, a $400 million infrastructure investment that then unlocks a piece of property? So you know where that fits on the cost, time, complexity axis, right? Versus, hey, it needs a road. That's a much lower cost, time, complexity axis. Or it might be, wow, the slope is so slopey that it's going to be out in a cost and complexity. So to me, the idea is to like work backwards from what would it take to make this buildable? Which tool is appropriate? Is it money? Is it, rearranging the Earth's topography? Is it, something that subsidizes a project that makes it pencil that it otherwise wouldn't pencil? Because then I think you can kind of categorize your solution, and things that are in short term, less cost, are more buildable. Things that are going to be way out on that axis, I think we all know, less likely to be buildable. And so that might be a way to look at it. And that's my thought, is start with the solution.
Steve, I'm going to be super rude and just
I saw it coming. Go ahead, Karin.
no etiquette today. And I hear you, Alyssa, and because I agree 100, I want to agree 110% with everything you just said. And then the context that we're working within is Oregon's land use system does not account for cost as a constraint. That is a huge departure from where we've been. Time. Oregon's land use system is built on with enough time, with enough incentive. So I agree with you, and I want to say there's something new coming. We've been talking about development readiness. So you've got this parcel that sits in the middle of your city that if you took it off your land inventory, I mean, you're not going to swap it out because it's already in your city and it's in the middle. It's not, to Steve's point, it's not on the edge of your UGB or your city. And what would it take? At what point do you deem there's no potential for development readiness on that land? Versus we got to look at what we have. Is there any possibility to bring that in? Because Sarah, that's to the point of serviceability, right? And that's why we get really uncomfortable about. Anyway, I know you agree with me and we agree with each other, Alyssa. There's just so much.
Well, we are on the same page totally, but I will say, right, how will I say this? If the goal is to make housing production easier, more rules don't tend to make things easier. And so I think when you look at it from the rulemaking side of it, you're like, well, how do we make a rule that makes it easier? And that's kind of a funny contradictory question. And so the question that is to me is, we know that some of this constrained land requires investment. It requires public facilities. It requires some kind of closing of a market feasibility gap. It requires making requires reducing the barrier to difficulty of it. And cost might not be the right word, but there's an investment tool that we need to acknowledge here, because frankly, if you're trying to make things more buildable, I think many of us in the small rural communities would say, hey, it does start actually with money. It does actually start with making an investment. And I'm actually kind of interested in the idea of taking out some of these not exactly buildable, but could be buildable with the right threshold, and turning them into what I would like to call like investment areas. Hey, this is an area that has high potential in our city, and we're going to put it in our HPS, and it's going to be an investment area. And we're going to throw our local financing tools at it, but we're also going to need to seek state resources or whatever the investment tools are. And maybe that's a way to move things from a rule to an actual opportunity to develop land into housing. And so I don't want to throw cost out, but I do think we have to acknowledge that significant investment is going to be needed to activate some of these lands.
I just want to plus one. Lisa just said, I mean, I think like we see this in Bend and Central Oregon a lot, right? That it is those investments that are standing in the way of land becoming ready for housing. And so I think that if the better we are able to put our finger on those properties, right, to say, these are the ones that need infrastructure investments of this nature, and it's this amount and this scale, that is super helpful because it's kind of it's its own thing. There are other constraints that are very different beasts, but that one is solvable in a lot of ways with the right targeted resources. So I very want to add a bit strong +1 to that comment. That really resonates. And then I think kind of to this question of sort of like the timing, right? Of like, how long has it been on the books? Like, and it hasn't done anything, right? Like the HPSs are on an 8-year cycle. And I think like what's really tough about what we're trying to do here is that we're trying to bring certainty to something that is very uncertain, right? We know infill development and redevelopment is really uncertain. It depends on the market. It depends on willing sellers. It depends on things that we don't have any control over. And so I just don't, it's tricky, right? And so my mind would be that we would need at least one HPS cycle, right? At least 8 years to keep that on the books, right? So nothing less than that, certainly, probably more like 2 at a minimum, right? And so in terms of trying to put a finer point, and there was a question of like, how's the timeline thing land for people? You know, I think it's a couple at least cycles of the HPS, really, especially as we're kind of early days in these things, right? These new processes. So just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Great, Corey. Thanks. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll actually echo Corey's last comment there. I don't think a 6 or 8 year period would be sufficient for this. I agree 100% that it needs to be a little bit longer than that. As far as like, well, I guess to Beth's comment about like, having a pocket of land in the middle of the city that's not developing, right? But could maybe there's like a comment box, I guess, for lack of a better term, right? Like, hey, we have this parcel of land, like we do recognize that it is buildable, right? Comment box, the reason we're not counting it is because the developer's unwilling to sell, right? Or the current owner's unwilling to sell to developer, something like that. And then I think the like cost and serviceability piece, I think that's how we differentiate between the development ready lands and the buildable lands. Right, buildable land is, in theory, it could be buildable, and that's the planning tool of like, hey, do we have just enough land generally, right? The development ready land being where you're targeting, current investments if needed, right, to bring those lands into development. And I think that's where kind of the cost and serviceability factor comes in to a greater extent than for the BLI, though I understand why considering those is important for some.
Great, Derek.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I don't know, I feel like a lot of this discussion does revolve around undeveloped lands. And I just wanted to put a plug in for some of the challenges that are holding us back on redevelopment of an existing basic urban core out here in Newport. Has to do with the age of the existing buildings and the fact that they're past their useful life. They're not designed such that you could actually add apartments on it. Say in our commercial areas where we've got property owners who'd love to do apartments over their first floor commercial, but the buildings are too old. They can't do that. And the challenge you run into is developers who'd like to do those projects are facing a situation where the person who owns that property still sees value in the improvement when there really is no value left in that improvement. And so you're having to deal with the cost of acquiring what really is a piece of land you want to buy, but then you're having to absorb the cost of that old aged building and then also absorb the cost of demolishing that building so that you can prepare the site for actual redevelopment. And these are in areas where we actually have the services to support the in this case, high density residential, but the cost of getting to a point where you can actually initiate the project is a real challenge.
Thanks, Derek. I want to check in with Cotton. It might be time to transition to our next topic. I think we've had a lot of good comments, but did you hear enough, or do you have any final questions for the group on this one?
Yeah, I guess I'll just make one more comment. You know, I think Heather mentioned it. I think Sam in the city of Portland has mentioned it before. Aside, right now, what we have, aside from policy adoption of an overlay zone or a planned area, an area plan, there's no way to discount right now. And so really looking at what tools the state can provide that does give clarity and certainty in what is traditionally very uncertain, I think, to Corey's point. So we'll need to noodle on this towards the fall. We'll sit with this. Hopefully we'll come back early next year with some ideas, probably some different options to consider for the group. But yeah, I think it'll be a little while before you hear from us as we kind of move into goal 14 with all of you. So Steve, remind me what's next on the agenda, because I already forgot.
I think you should pull up your PowerPoint. I think, excuse me, next up is talking about potential safe harbors, which is related. You know, yeah. I mean, it's definitely related to this topic, related to natural resources and hazards, but also if the data, state level data is sufficient. I think Beth prepared a memo on that we looked at.
All right. Actually, do you mind if I skip around? Ooh, I don't know where I am today. So aside from constraints, we have partially vacant land, right? This is another one we've been noodling around with. I think I have a couple visuals. Thank you, Beth and Steve provided me something. So this is what we've heard from you all. This won't be new to you, how you all are grappling with this. And then we wanted to talk through, you know, how could we address this? What does that look like? I think since Teams is not playing well, let me try. I think I might have a workaround. Oh, this is when you send up a prayer to IT that everything is going to work okay. All right, Steve, how does that look?
We can see that.
All right. So to that point, what am I looking at? Vacant land is in yellow, so there's dispersed pieces throughout this small city. Partially vacant is in pink.
Yeah.
So you can see there's development, you can see there's some availability, but it's kind of, you know, scattered, like what is where and how developed is it, what is partially vacant there. You all get the idea. I think the point I wanted to make and what this illustrates is how scattered this can be. And so how reliable is that for development? Again, we're talking about things that are very uncertain. I did want to show this one as well, because this is not in a city, but it's rather in the UGB. So let's see. Maybe I will do it this way. Sorry, y'all.
That's all right, Conan. While you're pulling that up, I think another just note on that last image is that, especially with your small partially vacant, there's so many factors, like depending on the placement of a house, if it's right in the middle of the lot, then is it really available or not? And when you have, like you said, a lot of really small part vacant lots dispersed, is that really viable for any significant development?
Yeah, and Corey mentioned that I went ahead and linked the memo that Beth put together for us. I think it was in May. Beth really illustrated for us, I think it might have been Madras, examples for Madras, around all the different complexities of partially vacant. But this example I thought was interesting. It's the city of Woodburn. And you can see where their city boundary is, and then their UGB boundary is this orange line. So what they have here are very parcelized rural residential. And most of these lots already have development on them, so they are mostly partially vacant lots. And these lots have been in the UGB, I want to say close to 10 years for the city of Woodburn. So as we think about, when they get to their 20-year planning horizon and we think about development readiness, what is within the city's control? What can they incentivize when they're very parcelized with improvements on it? So we have two different examples. To Steve's point, there's a lot of complexity within each parcel. Where's the improvement situated? How much is constrained? Then when they're all together like this as rural residential, they're all contiguous, or when they're scattered throughout, what does that look like? So I'm going to open it up for a second. Beth, you have some comments. I'll put a discussion question in the chat, and then us staff have been mulling over kind of 3 different topic areas on this subject to talk with you all about. So Beth, and then I'll get the discussion question in the chat, and then we'll dive into it.
So just adding to what Steve and Karen just said, this becomes more complex when you talk about partially vacant, where you're intersecting a constraint like steep slopes, because what you can do on flat land is really different than what you can do on sloped land. In doing this kind of work, I think nearly every reasonable person that I've worked with in the public or private sector, there's a point at which they can agree, oh yeah, while that has a house on it, there's more development potential, that be that at, larger than 2 acres, larger than 5 acres, whatever it is. The arguments tend to be about the smaller parcels, and then it tends to be different arguments in different places. Like when we did Hillsborough's housing needs analysis back in about 2016, so before the current housing market, they were seeing subdivision of a number of their larger lots near downtown. And so the market pressure was doing something that would be very different than you'd see in a Medford or a Madras or whatever. So this is going to play out in different ways in different cities.
Thanks, Beth. And I think going back to those objectives from the beginning of the meeting too, like what does this say about the analytical burden for cities to kind of dive in to each specific parcel, these really small parcels, and look at each one? That's a lot of time and effort for city staff. So a lot of considerations here. Any thoughts on how to treat how we might standardize an approach to partially vacant land, like the examples that Colin shared? And if not, it sounded like Colin, you maybe had a few thoughts to share. Heather.
Actually, I'm going to put my hand down because I'd be curious to hear what Colin has to say.
She takes it back.
This is why I don't play poker, because I got no poker face. Darn it, Heather. All right, we'll just lay it out there. So let's see. So we talked about in the constraints, small parcels, tiny little slivers that are buildable within constraints. I'm wondering how folks are feeling about partially vacant land. Is there a threshold considering minimum lot size, acreage that would be available for, say, infill? I think, I'm trying to think of thresholds to Beth's example where very clearly you could see a land division. Yep. Or, very clearly you could see adding on units. I don't know, Derek mentioned in his commercial zones, you could have ground floor commercial if the building wasn't sold. Let's just say it's a newer building that would hold, there are potential where you could see additional units add, but these smaller lots, And then what is each community might be slightly different? Or should it be consistent and standardized for cities below 10,000, for cities above 10, but below 25, and then 25 and above? Because I think for the larger cities, we expect a lot more density, right? And so those parcel size, half an acre, I lived in inner Northeast Portland. That is huge. You would not ever consider half an acre in inner Northeast Portland as developed. But my family lives out in Dundee, and that's very different in Yamhill County. So I'll put that one. I've got a couple others in my back pocket, but I'd like to hear from folks.
Now Heather's ready.
No, that's helpful. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, I mean, I think I can safely say that Eugene would really support some additional safe harbors for larger cities. We may have a robust tracking system, but that is in part because it took us so long to do our partially vacant analysis because there wasn't a safe harbor available. So I guess that's good that we have it. But anyway, I think, having a safe harbor around the existing, how much you would consider existing development on a developed property that might have partially vacant capacity be great. Having a safe harbor around, and when I say existing development, I think that one of the questions is, the building would be kind of an easy one, but we know that there's more to a development and improvement on that land than just the building. So thinking about what that means, is it, could you put a safe harbor around saying a certain percentage, a buffer off of the existing buildings as a percentage, or I'm not sure, a ratio or something like that. And then if you buffer off that and there isn't the minimum lot size, then there isn't partially vacant capacity. Something like that, a stepped process where you deduct for the structures and some percentage for existing development. And then if there isn't minimum lot size, buildable acres left that's unconstrained, then it's not considered partially vacant capacity. And then as far as the lot size for partially vacant versus redevelopment versus infill, at least for us, we kind of think about those as three different things. Redevelopment means new capacity with with demolition. And I know that's not what we're talking about right now, so I'll save the comments if we come back to that. But I just would agree with Newport about the fact that redevelopment is so much harder or is so hard to determine, when I think we also see in Eugene, even though somebody could add a lot of capacity, there's more value in them just keeping it as it is. Even if whether or not the building is a high value building or not, even with it vacant, there is more value oftentimes than redeveloping, because it costs so much to demo, redevelop, and for not, when you don't actually know exactly what the outcome is going to be. So I just would echo those comments. And I forget what I was going to have something else about partially vacant. So I'll put my hand up later about that.
Before you go back on mute, Heather, I think maybe you were going to the differences between redevelopment and infill and part vacant. If not, that's fine. But
the lot sizes, yeah. Just thinking about echoing your comment about a half acre is pretty big for our size of city. And so agreeing with the idea that you might have safe harbors for different size cities, that is more than just less than 10,000 or greater than 10,000 or less than 25 and greater, it does seem like there could be a greater split out for that. And I think that having safe harbors for the different lot sizes for those different categories would be helpful. And we could provide some data around that if that's helpful. I think one thing that is interesting about redevelopment and partially vacant is in both cases, you still have owner willingness as an issue. And I think that is a big part of where our phantom capacity comes in. You know, I can't remember if I mentioned this, but the last time we did our buildable lands inventory, we did look at like improvement value. Should we use improvement value to determine whether or not we think there's partially vacant capacity? And from an equity standpoint, we backed away from doing that because it's not really equitable because partially vacant does get mapped. And so you would be saying, well, this is a lower improvement value property. And so we're assuming that it is likely to add additional capacity. And we did not want to do that. So we were agnostic to the improvement value with regard to partially vacant capacity. And I think that causes some problems with phantom capacity because there is no deduction or accounting for the fact that, like we were talking about earlier, all properties are not going to redevelop in 20 years or add capacity, add units as a partially vacant lot in 20 years. So I think we would support some sort of acknowledgement around that.
Thank you so much, Heather. Derek.
Yeah, I'd like to just a couple things. You know, when we're looking at the partially vacant, you know, one thing that I try to keep in mind is that we're typically working with assessors maps, and those assessors maps show tax lots that are in many cases an aggregation of multiple legal lots. And where we see a lot of additional development are those where they actually do have multiple lots, and what they end up doing is that additional lot that ABC owner had for a long period of time, they finally decide to sell that lot and now it gets developed. So, you know, to the extent to which we can get past the assessor's maps and actually look at what the actual lot configurations are, I think that's informative. I think improvement to land value, I would echo Heather's comments about this. It's a tricky one. It does invoke equity issues, but what you do often see in these areas is those properties that get redeveloped sometimes are ones where they've let the improvement or the value of the improvement has dropped to the point where it's no longer something that they want to continue to use in that form, and then thus it makes it attractive to redevelop the property. It's the flip side to the other issue I was talking about. So if you have a very low improvement to land value, that often will tell you that, hey, this is a property that's likely to redevelop, and ideally at higher densities. With respect to high value land that's around the periphery, just inside the urban growth boundary, the equity issues, I don't really have anything good to offer up on that one. I know that, we have a lot of properties there where people, it's a lifestyle design. I mean, they want acreage and they want it proximate to an urban area. And there's a lot of drive there for, and desirability there. And those folks who are looking for that are simply not going to be interested in redeveloping.
Thank you, Derek. Yeah, Karen, do you want to, any other thoughts or reactions?
We don't have Ted here. And Sam, I don't know how applicable this is to Portland versus, say, maybe Gresham or Forest Grove or Cornelius. But, Metro has been using an improvement value threshold. I think it's $300,000. And I don't know if that's the right threshold. I don't know if that works well in the Metro region. I don't know if to Derek's point, if an improvement value threshold would work anywhere. Is that something that would be helpful in a city like Bend? And then is it less helpful in a city like Medford? I certainly yeah, it's hard to say. Like, you can't imagine any improvement value at 300,000 in Deschutes County. I don't know if you can get anything for 300,000 there, but the complexity of it, I hear you, Derek. It's a tough one to wade into, and Heather, I can see why your city is like, we're just not going there. We are agnostic to improvement value. But I'm curious if others have some thoughts on that. Beth, you've got a little more insight there.
Little clarification, Metro set that improvement value, which I think was 350,000, back is sometime in the mid 2000s or 2000 teens, when 350,000 actually meant something different. So if one wanted to use some sort of threshold, you might look at the median sales price and say something like 125% of the median sales price, or whatever you wanted to do, if you wanted to use something like that. That way you're pegging it to something that's changing with the market.
Thanks, Beth. Go ahead, Damian.
Thanks, Steve. One comment I had that I should have stated earlier was what I would recommend is incorporating a definition for partially vacant land that distinguishes it from land that is redevelopable, so that the reader understands that when we're talking about partially vacant land, this is land where additional units may be developed according to the current zoning, whereas redevelopable land might be rezoned, further developed beyond and what's already there. I don't know that I've got anything additional in terms of looking at this improvement to land value ratio. We've had some, I'll say, unusual situations where what you might call a perfectly good building was demoed and replaced with something new. But I don't know if that's indicative of a trend or just an isolated incident. So, something to think about as you look at a metric for redevelopment, and it might need some further work beyond our conversation today, I would think.
Okay, we'll go to Beth. I don't know if any of our smaller city reps who haven't spoken yet have any thoughts on either the part vacant threshold or this improvement to land value ratio. Maybe think about it for a few minutes and feel free to chime in. Go ahead, Beth.
I have some strong opinions about the improvement to land value ratio. We've tried using it in Springfield, I think in an EOA, but it would be the same problem in an HNA, where what's the right threshold to use when the improvement is equal to the land value, and the improvement's a little lower than the land value? How much is a little lower? Is it a 0.75? So what's the right threshold? And then it shows a lot of land in some cities, maybe in Bend. I don't know what it would show in Bend, Damien, but it's a really gross indicator that I think has some pretty big flaws in it for redevelopment potential, because of exactly what we've just talked about, owner preference for redevelopment. So I always think of the barber shack in downtown Eugene that is literally a shack on a kind of nice piece of land that has been there, I don't know, 50 years, whatever. Or some of the stuff that has happened where you had a perfectly good building that, redeveloped to something else. And those things happen. It's a little different for housing than it is for employment lands. But redevelopment's really hard to predict. And improvement to land value ratio, while it's easy to do, it's not, I think, in my opinion, it's not a great metric.
Anybody else on this topic? Corey.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I just wanted to share like a case study that I think kind of makes the point that Beth was just sharing that's kind of playing out here in Bend, right? Which is the Bend Central District, right? And this is a place that is supposed to be the place for so much of our growth moving forward. It's an opportunity area. We've stacked all kinds of incentives in this place, right? And it's very parcelized. and the parcels are very, very small. And so I think that even with us sort of stacking things and trying to put things in play there, right? And essentially what's happened, right, is that we've seen the land value increase dramatically, right? Which makes it so much harder for projects to pencil. And so we sort of like shot ourselves in the foot in a way of saying, this is where we really want to see these dramatic changes and these incredible investments in these complete communities. And we've done all the right things. And yet what we see is the public investment is happening, but on the private side, we have not seen the kind of redevelopment and infill rates that we would have liked to see or expected. And some of that has to do with the fact that the land values are just, they've become so much higher that like it's harder to get those projects and kinds of projects to pencil. And so I think I just wanted to share that kind of like local anecdote when we're trying to think about like what is the right way to set a threshold here. Like I do, the redevelopment stuff is just so tricky, and it's so, there's so many factors that are sort of outside of our control. So I feel like for me in this case, like very small lot size, I don't think that that's particularly problematic in this particular setting, right? And that you could bundle, we've seen instances where landowners have bundled things together and made it work, and now they're sitting on it, right? Waiting for some market condition to improve. And so I do think for me, like that land value piece in a place like this, like that's not going to be particularly helpful for us kind of moving forward with the kind of development that we want to see.
Thanks, Corey. Go ahead, Karen.
That's a great segue, and I know I'm running out of time. I gotta start hurrying. Whew, sorry about that. But that's a great segue, Corey, because Beth mentioned earlier that very little cities have no inventory of buildable land. I think she said one city had 3 acres, but most cities have quite a bit of acreage or significant acreage of inventory. And so our neighbors to the north, they use a market factor discount. I know we pride ourselves in doing things the Oregonian way, but to Beth's point, like, what does that mean when we know the majority of our UGVs hold significant inventory? Is that intentional? How does that serve the cities? Or is it a consequence of our land use system, an unintended consequence? And how does it not serve, or how does it limit cities? And if there's no comment, you can come to our session that Steve is hosting at OABA. We can talk about it there.
Good plug. Good plug. Heather, go ahead.
Just on that point, I mean, if there is somewhere else like Washington, they're not that far away, that have something that's working, I think we should be open to that. So it comes back to that question that I think Corey said earlier is, you know, do they feel good about it? Do they feel like it is actually working in Washington? And if it is a proven metric that helps us at this guesswork that we're doing, and feels pretty good, again, given that we're kind of using a crystal ball here, it seems like something worth pursuing.
Thanks, Beth.
And just to clarify, the market factor allows you to say in Washington, it's up to 25%. If you've got 100 acres of buildable land, we assume that 25% of it, we don't know which ones, will not develop over the planning period. So we're not counting that in our capacity. We're counting the capacity on that other 75%. And cities are allowed to use smaller, but not larger than the 25%.
Thank you, Beth. I know, yeah, I know we ran into the same thing recently in Canby, just the question of, we have this number of acres of vacant or partially vacant land, and we know based on, like we've talked about, maybe not talking about specific parcels, but we know that it's not all going to develop. So how do we approach that, and how do we think about that? And that's how Washington does it. As Karen said, I don't know that that that's the right or, not the right solution for Oregon, but it's worth a conversation. Anybody else on that? Let that sink in for a while.
Let's revisit that later in the year.
I think after our OAPA session, when we get a lot of good feedback.
So let me look for a thumbs up. Would you like staff to continue to research that example from the state of Washington?
I'm seeing some thumbs.
Right.
All right. Yes, real or virtual thumbs are acceptable. All right, Conan, I think we can transition into wrapping up for today. Those are great conversations.
Well, actually, I didn't get to roll my agenda items. So
Okay.
this is going to be, hang in there with us. We may not get to talk about this. Beth, do you want to just do a quick 2 minutes of the memo you put together? I will set you up of why we put that memo together. And for you all on TAC, it won't be a surprise to you. Many of you were looking for state provided, state maintained data. So we went to look at, when we think about hazards and constraints, what are the data sets that the state has available? What are consulting firms using? Consulting firms like Steve's and Beth's, and what data is available to you all as cities. So if you guys want to pull up that memo, and Beth will just describe really quickly kind of your experience with the data sets, your firm, and then I can share a little bit about what we've learned.
Okay, so the 2-minute tour. Exhibit 1 is about state available data, and we've gone from data that's more available to a little less available, or we don't know, or a little less frequently important. So things like steep slopes, landslide susceptibility, those are generally available across the state. I didn't know that floodplain data wasn't as available in a lot of counties, especially east of the Cascades. It makes sense where you've got fewer rivers. Wetland data is particularly difficult because it depends on you having a local wetland inventory and how old that is. And then things like tsunami inundation zone, BPA easements, those are things that are applicable to some cities and generally available. We haven't used data from ODF and W's compass tool about habitat boundaries. And I don't know that 3J had used that data either. Exhibit 2 is about city or region specific data. So Metro's got good information about stream and floodplain data in Title III and habitat data in Title 13. I actually don't know that it's good, but I assume it's good. And then you get down to things that are locally regulated. So things like riparians, wetlands, other water resources that have a setback. Sometimes you can get data from things like the National Hydrology data set. Sometimes cities have things mapped from their Goal 5 work. Some cities don't have those. And a lot of the time, whether you can consider those prohibitive constraints depends on what the city's policies are in regulating those. So do they regulate a riparian setback? So some of the data is pretty widely available from the state. Some of it is less so. I know that the Department of State Lands is working on a statewide wetlands inventory, but that's only going to be as good as the local wetlands inventories.
Yeah, and I think, the ask of us was, are there data sets that we can use that would give us safe harbor, greater legal certainty? And this is where, careful what you say, because we've got it all recorded, but way back in April, Derek said, he cautioned us all to really think about these inventories are developed for different purposes for these departments, whether that's ODF and W, DSL, and they have different objectives that may not be helpful at times, or the data just requires additional analysis at the local level. So to Beth's point, that the state wetlands inventory is really looking at national wetland. They start with the base of the national, which is very coarse, and then they're adding in any LWIs. And then I think in the last few years, they added in a new layer of hydric soils layer. ODF and W and their habitat I'm trying to learn a lot. I have a meeting with ODF&W later today, I think, to figure out, and that's not a goal 5 protected resource. So what does that mean for your capacity versus your land inventory? How is that impacting development feasibility? So I guess, Derek, not to put you on the spot, but you guys have a lot of experience with data that comes to you and it's not quite local reflective of the local conditions and how you would use that data.
Yeah, so no, that's accurate. I mean, geologic hazards is a good example, and led to a very extensive and somewhat painful discussion locally as we work through. Because geologic hazards maps in our community, I'm just using that as an example, were developed by State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, and for different purposes than really to inform whether or not property is or shouldn't be developed with housing. And so what we ended up having to do, frankly, is take that information and just really take it through that local lens and determine, what piece of that made sense to us relative to housing and other forms of development, and which pieces didn't. Is that kind of getting at what you're looking for?
So Damien, and then a question to you, and then and then I'll do my wrap up in like 30 seconds. I think some of those riparian buffers, I mean, Damien, you've shared with our group that if it's not the inventory, it's at least some of the capacity, the impacts on capacity in Deschutes County with some of these natural resources, whether they're Goal 5 protected or not. And when you think about what Derek just shared, if there are safe harbors using this data, then you would have to use this data, but a safe harbor is optional. But why create safe harbors that aren't going to be useful? So curious what your city might be seeking in for additional support and clarity.
That's a good question. With respect to riparian areas, we have good data on lot locations, dimensions, and required setbacks from the river. So we know how much buildable area we're dealing with. And I think most of those areas, we're also dealing with, primarily single family zoning. So estimating development potential is not that challenging. I think where it might become more challenging is if we were to either look at rezoning or incorporating in our UGB additional areas along the river that might have different zoning for, say, multi-unit development, maybe some kind of mixed-use development. So in those kind of cases, maybe a safe harbor that would be helpful as an example is, everything 100 feet from the ordinary high water mark is considered, something you don't have to worry about. And I might need to noodle on that some more to give you better feedback.
All right, I will, I might even just open up a mirror board. Does that sound like folks? Okay, let's do a mirror board for this meeting, which I did not prepare. So give me a second, or it might take me until Friday to get that mirror board out. We're gonna take a beat. We will not see you all until October. So enjoy the month of September. Steve, remind me, there's probably things I was supposed to share.
Well, Thursday, October 3rd is our next meeting date. Should also probably mention that the second meeting in October is on the 15th, I believe, to avoid, no, is that wrong? No, it is the 15th, to avoid the OAPA conference. That is at the end of that week. So the 3rd and the 15th, that's the first Thursday and then the Tuesday are the next two meetings in October. And we're going to be talking about Goal 14. So kind of a shift in, certainly related, but a little bit of a shift in what we've been talking about. And we'll talk about Goal 14 until staff is ready to come back with some draft rules around Goal 10 for us to react to. Is that all accurate, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's a wrap. The last thing I will say, and we'll let you all go, I look forward to seeing you in October. We'll talk about UGB amendments. The last thing is tomorrow the RAC meets, the Rules Advisory Committee. So if you all are interested in their discussion on contextualized housing need, whether there needs to be safe harbors there, if you're interested in how the acceleration program will assist cities in housing production, how it creates accountability, tune in tomorrow to the RAC, or you can watch the recording afterwards. That's all I've got for now, and I'll open up that mirror board for y'all. Sorry about that.
Thanks, everyone.